some of the topics that we've been talking about are, in a sense, we're not really at the heart of Hinduism or the main central religious traditions of India, in the sense that, of course, Buddhism was something which was prominent in India for some time, and even Jainism, but ultimately was not really the central tradition, although it definitely affected the central tradition and in some ways transformed it. And we've also been discussing some intellectual aspects of Indian history. For example, Buddhist philosophy, Mimamsa philosophy, the ritual philosophy, and Vedanta, Shankara and Ramanuja, and so on. And so today we're really going to the heart of, I guess you could call it Hinduism if you want, or the heart of the central religious traditions of India. And that is, we're going to talk about the Ramayana, which is something which practically everybody understands to some extent, everyone is interested in, everyone participates in. And I mentioned earlier that ultimately the big winner in India, all these different, not battles, but there's always competition, different intellectual traditions, ritual traditions, Vedic, non-Vedic, and so on. And so ultimately, what really moved most of the people, most of the time, is bhakti, or devotion. I mean, if you look at Christianity, which has, of course, is very diverse, there are many different kinds of Christianity. There's asceticism, and piety, and theology, and of course, ultimately, it seems like the center of it is a type of devotion toward a figure, Jesus. And even if you look at Buddhism, what ultimately prevails in Buddhism is a type of devotion, the bodhisattvas, who themselves are devoted to helping the people, and the people are devoted to their bodhisattvas. And even in Jainism, the role of the Jinna, or the Tirthankara, the bridge maker, the Tirthankara, or the Jina, the conqueror, these great figures like Mahavir and so on. And, down on the ground, in real religion as people live it, it's this devotion to these figures that actually kind of makes everything hang together. So on the Hindu side, the Vedic or Hindu side, and the word Hindu, by the way, I say a few words about that, it's still almost anachronistic. If you study the history of the use of the word Hindu, maybe we'll just talk about this briefly because we use the word Hindu from time to time. You have a Vedic tradition where they don't really have the notion of, how should I put it, not so much the notion of sectarian religion in terms of, say in the West we understand there's Christianity, there's Judaism, there's Islam or something like that. It was, people shared the same general culture. And so someone might be a Mimamsa person, someone who was into the ritual, someone might be a Vedantist, or someone might worship Shiva, or Krishna, or Rama, or whatever. Or someone might be into the philosophy of the Upanishads, but somehow it all hung together as a civilization. And people might say this is better, and they did say this is better than that. But there wasn't so much the idea of false religions, at least not within the Vedic fold. Buddhism, which denied the Vedas, they might say, well, that's false because the Vedas are real. But within the Vedic tradition, it was more like what's more important, or what's less important, what's more powerful, what's the best way to go. But what happened is, and we'll talk about this later, with the Muslim invasion of India about 1,000 years ago, the Muslims called everybody in India that wasn't a Muslim a Hindu. Because I think we went over this, didn't we? That was a geographic term. And so I'm using the word Hindu somewhat untechnically, but so when we talk about, let's say, 2,000 years ago, when we use the word Hindu, people tend to call themselves Hindus back then. So we're using the term very roughly. But if you say Vedic, so you could say Vedic/Hindu. In other words, people that accepted the authority of the Vedas. That's what we're talking about. At that time, they're not calling themselves Hindu. But we have this book, the Ramayana. So how old is the Ramayana? The problem is that the Ramayana, like many books in India, has an oral tradition because it's a very ancient civilization, and writing doesn't begin until about 2,300, 2,400 years ago. And so by the time people start writing things down in India, they already have a culture. It's not like they started writing and said, hey, now that we know how to write, maybe we should have some books. Like, we don't have books, so let's write books. No, they had books, they had culture, they had tradition, they told stories, they had sacred traditions. And at a certain point it gets written down. And first of all, oral traditions can be somewhat unstable because you have different people reciting these traditions in different vernacular languages. They don't necessarily talk to each other. And different regions develop different ideas. And also, even when things get written down, over time, you get interpolations. New material starts cropping up. So if you take a book like the Ramayana, the written version is said to be to come from between approximately 400 BCE to 200 CE. But then again, some scholars feel that, well, maybe the tradition itself goes back thousands of years. And they give dates like 7,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. Maybe it was compiled. Now, just to give an example, and this, of course, gets back into the whole Indo-European question. Like, how old is this civilization? How old is it really? And so if you look at Homer, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, scholars agree that Homer wrote down or kind of gave a great version of a tradition that went back a long time before then. So Homer didn't just create the Iliad and the Odyssey. He sort of formalized it, and he told the story so well that people thought, let's just go with Homer. But actually, it was an old tradition by the time Homer got his hands on it. So I remember one time when I was in graduate school, I asked an archaeologist there, this is at Harvard, an archaeologist who was in charge of the American archaeological mission in Harappa. You remember this Harappan civilization? We talked about that, right? Indus Valley civilization. So this Professor Meadows, an archaeologist, was actually in charge of the American mission there, the archaeological mission. And the question I asked him was, if you get, let's say, at an archaeological site, very simple artifacts, like a few pot shards, or some bones, or some grains, or the foundation of some kind of building, or whatever. In other words, very simple archaeological remains. Could you still have an intellectually and culturally very sophisticated civilization? And of course, he said yes. I mean, that's what I wanted him to say, and that's what he did say. So, in other words, if you think about it, we tend to associate certain kinds of material culture with advanced civilization. Like if you're advanced, you have big box stores, or you have automobiles, or airplanes, or even, let's say, going back to, say, the classical civilization in Europe, Greco-Roman civilization, used to have monumental architecture, or all kinds of fancy sculptures, or whatever. So we tend to associate certain kinds of material phenomena with a certain level of civilization, like people are advanced if they produce and leave behind them these kinds of material artifacts. However, it's not impossible that people might have had a different take on that. For example, I remember in America, the last 20 years or so, there's been a phenomenon which sociologists call voluntary simplification. In other words, there was a time in America where the more money you have, the more you buy. So if you live a simple life, there's only one reason for that. You haven't got a lot of money. Because if you did have money, you'd be buying things. However, there's also a phenomenon, sort of like an America Shramana movement, where people do have the money, but they decide, I'd rather have a simple life. Like, I'd rather ride a bicycle than drive a fancy car because it's healthier and I don't want to poison the earth and so on and so forth. And, for example, in Germany, there's a phenomenon where people would rather not work as hard and ride a bicycle rather than work harder and buy a big car. They just would rather have a simple life. And in America also, especially interestingly, among more educated segments of the population, there is a trend toward voluntary simplification, like I choose, I prefer to have a simpler life. So in my scale of values, I think I'd rather have less material things but have more free time or live in a better environment, etc., etc. And as I said, this voluntary simplification tends to be associated with more educated segments of the population. So now take this even farther down the road. What if you had a civilization that was quite materially advanced? Forget that. What if you had a civilization that was, let's say, spiritually advanced? in the sense that people were in a relatively high state of consciousness in terms of the cultivation of virtue, the value they placed upon the big picture of what life is all about, and so on. And let's say they tended to live simply. They simply chose to live very simply. They didn't want to build large buildings and so on and so forth. And so they leave behind them very little in the way of archaeological remnants. So if you just find a few pots or this or that, what do we really know about these people? Now maybe they didn't produce great art, but maybe that's because they were, could you be in a state of consciousness where the world is art? Where you just like get up in the morning and look around you, and in a certain level of consciousness, everything you see is actually quite interesting and quite beautiful because of the state of consciousness you're in, and therefore you don't feel, let's say, driven necessarily to produce an abstraction of what you're actually directly conscious of in the form of visual art. Because, the universe itself is kind of like your canvas. So, all I'm saying is that we cannot necessarily correlate the simplicity of archaeological remains with a particular level of consciousness or culture. And so therefore we have remains of civilization, let's say in northwest South Asia, the Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappan, that whole actually Indus Valley and Saraswati Valley, the civilization going back, 10,000 years, 9 or 10,000 years or more. And we don't really know what state of consciousness those people were in. We don't necessarily know what their religion was, or because, for one thing, they didn't write. So what if everyone just kind of knew things? What if, you see, I'm not saying this is true. I'm simply saying that to be fair, to have a level playing field here, we have to consider real possibilities. And there is even actually a belief you find in Christian theology, going back a very long time, in what they call philosophia perennial. Let's write that. We will eventually get to the Ramayana today, but in the Latin, it's like this. Obviously, it just means perennial philosophy. And the idea is that even though culture changes, people change, history goes this way and that way, there is actually a truth about life. There's actually a truth about life. So that if you study wisdom traditions around the world, you find that, let's say, putting aside some of their more dogmatic and fanatical claims, but looking at the underlying wisdom, it tends to be the same in terms of what is a good life, what is the nature of the soul, and so on and so forth, and what is a healthy relationship with nature and the universe. And so, if there's been an attack on objectivity in the postmodern world, but of course if you say we can never really be objective, as I said, the immediate problem is that statement isn't objective, so therefore we're back where we started from. But in any case, if there is such a thing, and that's a possibility that at least I think deserves to be put out there as a possibility, if it is the case that there is an objective truth to the universe, and even if there's something like an objective metaphysical truth concerning God, soul, or whatever, if there is something like an objective truth about that, and if people at different times and places and different traditions in history discovered that truth, somehow tune into it, then you could have, theoretically, a people who are in a very advanced state of consciousness who choose to live very, very simply and choose not to produce all kinds of material things, from monumental architecture to even, let's say, all kinds of art products, because they're actually more concerned with their consciousness, and actually, the universe is their art, so to speak. So that is a possibility. And I think we have to put it out there so that you realize that when you get other interpretations of the archaeological record or whatever, that it is simply an interpretation. And by the same token, the more people know, the less you have to tell them. So if you have a time when literature is very simple and doesn't talk so much or go into detail about things, it may be that people didn't know that much, or it may mean they knew a lot more and therefore didn't need to talk about it so much because everyone understood it. And so there's all kinds of possibilities, which I think just in the interest of fairness we have to put out. Yes?
And I think just to put your point, the flip side is the Roman civilization, which produced gold and all kind of art and lined up in anything.
Yeah, although I kind of like the Romans. But, I mean, not the tyrannical emperors and, all that stuff, but anyway, poor Romans. So, I Romani. Anyway, the Ramayana. So the reason I went into that whole spiel is because we don't really know how old the Ramayana tradition is. And if you have a core narrative which goes way back, and then over time, even within South Asia, let's say it gets, how should I put it, adjusted. There are interpolations, or people sort of rework it according to issues that are going on at their time. For example, there was a time in Indian history when people were very concerned with the type of fatalism. In other words, they have this debate, which I've talked about, between Purusha Kara, human effort, and Daiva, destiny. So that at a time when they're more concerned, or they tend to believe that human beings, you can't do that much because it's all really higher powers, and we're really helpless under these higher powers, the gods or the goddesses. So that seeps into the literature. All kinds of things can seep into these traditions. And yet there may be an original narrative which is extremely old. So anyway, the Ramayana is attributed to, of course, Valmiki. There's even a story about how he came to become a Ram Bhakta. That means a devotee of Ram. There's a famous story that he was not at all spiritually inclined, actually. And I think it was Narada, the great sage Narada, approached him and said, "Why don't you devote yourself to Rama?" And he said, "No way." He was totally uninterested. And then I think Narada told him, "Why don't you chant the name of Rama?" No. So then Narada said, "You want to live forever?" "Yes." "Okay, then why don't you chant this?" So he gave him this word to chant, Amara. Amara is just like mortal in English, deaf. So Amara means deathless. So he said, "Just chant this, deathless." So he did. So he thought, "Okay, I'll chant that." And he chant Amara, Amara. It comes out Rama. You have to say it real fast. And so by chanting the name of Ram, he was converted. Anyway, so Valmiki is considered to be like the first great poet of Indian history, first great poet. The Ramayana, of course, is quite poetic. It has an extraordinary power. I mean, Ram in India, it's really hard to exaggerate how important Ram is in India. He's really, you could say, practically in the heart of almost everyone. It's a very big, huge thing in India, Rama. And basically, I mean, you could, when you greet a Hindu on the street, you can just say Jai Ram, like glory to Ram or something. And that's just like, and so, I mean, Ram Leela, they reenact the story of Ram every year at different times, and millions of people go to these things. In terms of Indian politics, there was a huge shift in national politics in India because there was an attempt to restore the birthplace of Ram, a temple at his birthplace, and the party in power didn't want to restore that temple because it had been taken over by the Muslims. Had a policy, and other religions have had policies like Christians back in those days, that when they would conquer a place, they would take all the holy places and sort of trash them or transform them into mosques or churches, whatever. So apparently there was a mandir, a Hindu temple, at the place of Ram's birth that had been changed into a mosque, which wasn't even being used. The Hindus kind of, they seized that place. They wanted to turn it back into a temple. And the government said, you can't do that because, it's private property now. But anyway, so the whole government of India fell over this issue because they didn't support Ram. I mean, so it's a very big thing. There was a television series on Ram, which, practically the whole country watched. So Ram, the story of Ram, is really at the heart of Hinduism. Anyone that knows anything about Hinduism knows that. It's extremely important. So, again, we've talked about all these philosophical things, intellectual things, and this and that, but this is really the heart of it all. Stories like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata that we'll talk about a little later. You okay? Oh, I mean, feel free if you have to say it. It's one of the basic human rights. So, the Ramayana as a genre. The Ramayana as... God, I write too big. The Ramayana as a genre is called itihasa, which I think I've explained. History. In other words, within the Hindu tradition, this is history. It's not mythology. And these words are iti, thus, ha, indeed, in the past, it happened, or it was. So, it's itihasa, and as far as how old this is, in the old Vedas, like say Chandogya Upanishad, you find the statement Itihasu Puranancha Panchmo Veda Uchate. So the Vedic literature itself says that this genre is a fifth Veda, So it has a very high status. Everyone kind of accepts it as a holy scripture. And what's at stake here, like you say this is mythology or this really happened or something like this happened, what's really at stake here is Hindus are fighting for time and space. It's almost like the politics of time and space. So that if someone, let's say, buys into the Western academic view of it, that this is just mythology and things like this don't really happen, then from the Hindu perspective, they kind of have lost their time and space because they see this happened a long time ago and it happened in a holy place and all that gets kind of removed and they're stripped of their sacred time and space. There's a lot at stake for them. And the basic point, and we're actually, believe it or not, going to get to the story itself eventually, but the essence of this story really is that God comes down to this world. And the word for this is avatara. And I've translated this, ava means down or downward, tara means crossing. The idea is there is a spiritual realm, and there's, good old Earth, and the material realm down here and other planets. The idea is that when God, or an empowered representative of God, crosses down from the spiritual realm down to the material realm, that's called an avatar, or a down crossing, literally. And interestingly, the holy places where people go on pilgrimage to get sanctified and to get liberated, those holy places are called tirthas. And this word tirtha is actually made from the same root as the word tara. And so this also means a crossing. So the idea is that God, or some empowered soul, crosses down to the material realm, and then if you go to those places where, let's say, that avatar lived or performed different miraculous activities, if you go to those places, you can cross back up to the spiritual realm. The idea being that when an avatar comes down, God, let's say, or representative of God, that in a sense they're always living in their own spiritual space. So that when an avatar comes down, the place where they live or the place where they perform their deeds becomes spiritualized. The avatar doesn't become materialized or mundanized by coming down to this world. It's just the opposite. The avatar spiritualizes whatever space that he or she moves in. So therefore, when you go to those places, even in Buddhism, which supposedly doesn't have God, right? They were huge on this point of pilgrimage. Like going to the holy places where Buddha came. I mean, they were totally into it. They still are. So the idea is when you go to these places, because the spiritual energy is still there, it's still a spiritual place, you cross back up to the spiritual realm. So it's, someone comes down, creates a spiritual space on earth for you, and then you go to that place and you cross back up. That's the basic idea. You can see this, for example, in Israel. The Sea of Galilee, if you drive around the Sea of Galilee, they have all these historical markers or pilgrimage markers that here Jesus did this, here Jesus did that, here was the Sermon on the Mount, here's where he created the loaves of bread, and so on. And then you swim in the Jordan River. I actually did that. It actually felt like a sacred place to me, but anyway. So that's the idea. In cultures all around the world, they have this notion that you go to these sacred places and you get spiritualized because the spiritual energy is left there from the presence of some kind of avatar, someone that came down. So Rama, the Ramayana, is just one of the great stories of an avatar. That's the point. It's one of the great stories of an avatar, and one of the greatest in Indian civilization. Any questions so far on this? Another thing I wanted to mention, and we'll have next Wednesday also, if the world still exists, to talk about this, but I want to say one thing in understanding the Ramayana, the story about the sort of like a moral strategy. I wrote that. It's like a realistic moral strategy. If you study the history of monarchy, or if you study the history of the American presidency for that matter, powerful political leaders tend to be promiscuous. All this power tends to get to people's heads, and it's very passionate, and people get a little funny. And so power and promiscuity really go together, historically. Not every time, but a lot of the time. And kings also, these are not like our modern politicians that, sit in air-conditioned rooms and stuff. In the past, the leaders were warriors. They would go out and personally lead the battle. They would lead the charge. And often, if you study the history of warfare, they were the first to die. So it was a different lifestyle than a modern politician. And so warriors were also prone to hunting. Now here's two activities, namely sexual promiscuity and hunting, which were actually very much frowned upon in this Brahminical, you could say even Buddhist Jain culture. And yet, it gets into this issue which is practically the main issue in the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament. And that is, how do you speak truth to power? You've got someone that has a lot of power, and proud people tend to be, they can be jerks, proud, powerful people. And so how do you speak the truth to them? Because, if you have a lot of power and you just make a little mistake, you can hurt a lot of people. It's like, because you're powerful compared to insects, when you walk on the sidewalk, if you happen to step on one, it's history for that insect. So when you're a ruler, when you're a monarch, you have all this power just on your whim. If you don't like someone, you can just kind of like, get out of my face. But when a king does that, the person may have their head chopped off. So, because they're so powerful. So, how do you speak truth to power? One strategy which we find in the Ramayana and many other of these literatures is that the sages simply tell stories of people that did certain things and it really blew up in their face. So rather than directly confront them and say, don't do this, okay, here's what a king did and look what happened to him. So an example of that is polygamy, which was common then, especially for kings. And so it obviously didn't work that well, because the Sanskrit word co-wife, sapatni, this is masculine, feminine word, of course, sapatni. Now if you just change it to the masculine, sapatna, it means enemy. So what does that tell you? The word for co-wife means enemy. And also, there are many stories in the literature. In a sense, in the Ramayana, the whole problem, as you'll see, came from polygamy. Because the king had more than one wife, it basically ruined his life. Or hunting. Let's just get into the story and you'll see what happens. It starts with a king named Dasharatha. It must be in your book, right? Dasharatha? You got that, don't you? Which literally means 10 chariots or 10 cars. Dasha is decimal, 10. So anyway, Dasharatha. He was a king of Ayodhya, which is, if you know Indian geography, Ayodhya, and the kingdom of Kosal. Let's see. There's India, right? And here's the Himalayan mountains up here. Whoops. Here are the Himalayan mountains and so on. And so it'll be right about here. Here's Bengal and then Bihar and so on. So it'll be more or less about there. And then the Ganges comes down. So Dasharatha was once hunting. Again, he was out hunting and he saw what he thought was a deer. And so he shot it and killed it. Unfortunately, it was not a deer, it was a young Brahmin boy. When we killed. And to make matters worse, that young Brahmin boy was the only support of his parents, who were both blind. They were elderly Brahmins who were blind. So this is like a worst case scenario. Yes?
It said in the book that he killed a deer that was copulated.
That's Pandu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, wrong epic.
Totally wrong epic.
Well, they're the same. We'll get to that. That's Mahabharata. So, anyway, he killed this boy, and so when the parents heard about this, first of all, they were going to die of grief, and they were going to die materially. They were out in the forest. They were shamanas, actually, out in the forest. They had no one else to take care of them. They were elderly and blind. Plus, that was their boy. They loved very much, and so this king just killed him. So basically, on every level, their life was finished. So before they actually gave up their lives out of grief, they cursed the king that you will also die of grief by losing your son. But the same thing you did to us will happen to you. You will die of grief by losing your son. And of course, Dasharatha is the father of Ram. So again, The story doesn't say you can't hunt. It just says, okay, here's a hunting accident. And the literature is full of hunting accidents. Tragic, disastrous hunting accidents. Anyway, so Dasharatha sort of forgets, he's disturbed, but he kind of over time, years pass, and he kind of forgets this curse. And then he's in a battle one time, and he's in a real bad situation. And his wife, among his 3 wives, one of his wives, Kaikeyi, what's in the book? Kaikeyi, which means from the kingdom of Kaikeyi. Kaikeyi, very courageously, actually comes onto the battlefield, risking her own life, and rescues her husband. Which shows you this idea of sort of like, the humble Hindu lady is, anyway, it wasn't exactly like that. She comes charging onto the battlefield and saves her husband. He's so pleased with her, he says that he will give her 2 boons, like she can ask for any 2 things she wants, and he'll give it to her. And so she is quite shrewd and says, okay, thank you, but she doesn't want to cash him in yet. She's going to wait for the right moment. So then Dasharatha is having trouble begetting sons, and you really need sons because you have to continue the dynasty. This is a martial society. And another reason for polygamy was that the lifespan for warriors was not always the highest. And so there was this idea that you need a lot of sons to make sure some of them survive and the dynasty continues, and which they saw as necessary for cultural and political stability. So anyway, he can't beget a son, so the Brahmins perform. He actually pleases the gods. The gods come with some bowl of ambrosia. His wives drink it, and then they become pregnant. So they need the help of the Brahmins to become pregnant. And the oldest son is Rama. But the problem is that Kaikeyi's son, Lakshman, is not the oldest son, so Rama's going to become king. And Rama is an ideal, yes?
Isn't it Bharat instead of Lakshman?
I'm sorry, Bharat. Yeah. Did I say Lakshman?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes, it is Bharata. Lakshman is the brother who's very attached to Ram. So Ram is the avatar. Oops, the word avatar used to be there. Visualize world avatar. So anyway, so Ram, they're all avatars. Actually, Ram, Lakshman, Shatrugna, and Bharata, the 4 sons, are all considered to be forms of Vishnu, or avatars. Life is going on very nicely, and Dasharatha wants to retire and, of course, make Ram the king. But then there's a hunchback maidservant of Kaikeyi that starts to sort of poison her mind by saying, hey, look, when Ram's king, your brother is going to be in trouble because, but Ram's not going to treat him nicely, and Ram may even do something bad to him, and so you really better defend your child. So if you really love your child, you better cash in your boons now. So at first, Kaikeyi resists. Finally, she sort of, as they say, soft water wears away the stone. She gives in, and her mind becomes poisoned by this, even though she's always loved Ram, and Ram's like a son to her. So she tells Dasharatha, I now want to choose my 2 boons. By the first boon, I want, I forget which one was first, but anyway, one boon is Ram should be banished to the forest for 14 years. Ram has to be banished. And my son should be coronated as king. Bharata should become the king. So the king is so attached to Ram because, again, you have to see this not only from a human perspective, but from the spiritual, religious perspective. Ram is an incarnation of God. And Dasharatha is a great soul who has taken birth in this world as the father of an incarnation. And so everything associated with the activities of Ram, his parents and everything, the people who are his intimate associates are actually special souls that in a sense have incarnated with him to display this Leela. This is Leela, like these pastimes. And the idea even is given in these texts that the reason the avatar comes down ultimately is to attract souls back to God by, all these dramatic narratives. There's something else going on here, by the way, with another reason Ram came down, and that is there's a big demon named Ravana. He's a very famous demon. That's in the book, right? I don't have to write that, Ravana. Even his name is from the Sanskrit root ru, which means to cry. It means that he just made people cry in agony because he was just such a bad guy. So that's Ravana. So Ravana was this gentleman who performed all these austerities. There's this very strong idea in all these literatures. That is, if you perform tapasya or asceticism, self-abnegation, if you fast and sort of voluntarily accept all kinds of bodily inconvenience, like people would, they have something called Panchagni, 5 fires, where in the summer, and it gets very hot in India during the summer. I mean, it gets really hot. Unless you're way up in the mountains, it's like ridiculously hot. We're talking about, 120 or whatever in the Ganges Valley. And so these yogis, they would light fires on all 4 sides of them and then stand in the middle of these fires under the sun in the summer. It's like 120 degrees out. Or they would stand in water on 1 foot, or they would just eat leaves that fell down from trees, naturally fell from trees. And so and the idea is that by these, and they're demonic, some austerities were actually considered to be demonic. Like people would cut flesh from their bodies and offer it into the fire. But that was, even back in the culture, that was considered to be like dark and demonic. And so this idea that you perform austerities and you get boons, the gods have to come to you and offer you rewards because of your self-denial, is a very, very central part of this whole culture, the yoga, the asceticism, the shamana movement's big on this. And so, anyway, Ravana, who was a Rakshasa, sort of your generic monster, he performed all these austerities. Finally, Brahma, the creator, had to come to him and offer him a boon. And he said he wanted to be invulnerable so that no god or spirit or animal could kill him. I think that's it. Wasn't it those 3? Where'd my Ravana go? Oh my God. Got all that down. Where'd my Ravana? Yeah, that's it. Gods, demons, or spirits. Ravana, by the way, had 10 heads. He's called Dashamukha. He had 10 heads and 20 arms. So he was really good at martial arts. 20 arms, and so... Anyway, so Brahma gave these powers. Ravana was so proud, he didn't ask for protection against humans. He thought humans were puny. And so therefore the idea is that Rama, even though he's Vishnu or God, he came down like a human. He came down in the form of a human being because that way he could preserve the boon given to Ravana and still kill him. So Ram comes as a human to get rid of this demon. Anyway, so Dasharatha passes away out of grief because Ram has to go to the forest. Dasharatha tells his son, look, never mind what I said. Why don't you, better you just kill me and stay. I don't want to banish you. But Ram insists on being honorable and actually following the command of his father. So this is one of the examples where Ram is the ideal son and eventually will become the ideal ruler. So he goes to this forest, and anyway, he's going to the forest. Lakshman, who's very attached to Ram, insists on going with him. And Sita, I should mention Sita. Sita is like probably the most famous lady in India. Anyway, when Ram is young, he goes, Vishwamitra, his guru, comes to Ayodhya and tells his father Dasharatha that there are these demons who are attacking the Brahmins. We need Ram to come and kill the demons. So Dasharatha reluctantly let him go. Ram kills the demons because he's like the super warrior. And then Vishwamitra takes him to this, what is called a Swayamvara. A Swayamvara literally means your own choice. The idea was that aristocratic girls could set up these competitions where all the princes in the land would come and compete for their hand. And the princesses could set up the rules of the competition and ultimately choose the guy they wanted. And so Sita, it's still there. Okay. It would be sort of like over here, a little farther north was the kingdom of Sita, and the king was Janaka. So Sita, this most beautiful young girl, who had a divine birth also. Her father was, they were plowing the land for a sacred sacrifice. And in a furrow, because Sita means furrow, in a furrow of the land, they found this beautiful baby girl, who actually, because she's also an avatar, she comes down with Ram. The idea is that Sita and Ram are an eternal romantic couple. Sita and Ram are eternal lovers, and so when Ram comes, Sita also comes. So anyway, Sita came down also, and it was her Swayamvara. She was going to choose her husband. So Sita, who kind of knew that she was supposed to be with Ram, because she kind of knew she was an avatar. So they set up this condition for the Swayamvara that a prince had to string this bow, and then wasn't it hit a target to win Sita's hand. The bow was like ridiculously unstringable. it was like, it's almost like this solid iron bow. You just couldn't string it. So all the great warriors came. The Shiva's bow, wasn't it?
Yeah, she was.
Yeah, the bow of the god Shiva. Anyway, no one could string this bow, and Ram just came and took the bow in his hands and just broke it in half, which was convincing. So Ram wins Sita, and they go to Ayodhya. So when Ram has to leave, Ram is afraid that Sita, who's lived all her life as a, not pampered, but the lack of luxury. She's been a princess. She's had every opulence, and how could she live in the forest where there's all kinds of dangerous animals and monsters and evil, it's extremely dangerous out there. There are no bodily comforts. And so he assumes that he has to leave Sita there. And so Sita bitterly complains, and she says, like, what are you thinking? If we love each other, how am I going to stay here? And so Sita absolutely insists that I'm going with you. And she does. So Sita goes with Ram out to the forest, and they're living there kind of, periodically killing monsters. I mean, these demons who are harassing innocent people. Any questions so far in this story? Ramayana. Yes.
Oh, Sita incarnation of Vishnu?
Yes.
Consort Lakshmi.
Yeah, Sita is Lakshmi. Yeah, the idea is that in this tradition, that when we talk about the absolute truth, or the Parang Satyam, we talk about Brahman, the highest truth, that male and female. Now, of course, come in. As you can see, this is very different from Shankara, because Shankara is saying that all variety is illusion. All variety is illusion. There is no eternal romance. There are no eternal boys and girls. And that when we think there's a God, it's simply illusion hitting this Brahman. Oh, he's writing something. I guess it must be a board of this. Now, on this Vaishnav side, worshippers of Vishnu, and it's really the heart of Hinduism, it's exactly the opposite. Ram is eternal, and Sita is eternal, and they're eternal lovers. And actually, the absolute truth, the Brahman, ultimately includes the male and female. The reason why there are males and females in this world, and the reason they tend to like each other under appropriate circumstances, is that it exists in God. And so I quoted from the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says that actually we're all part of God. Shankara says no parts. The Bhagavad Gita says the opposite, that actually we're all part of God. So because we're part of God, we have the same nature as God, just in a smaller quantity. We're tiny and God is great, but still we're part of God. So as in God, there's this romantic nature, that even in God you find male and female romance. So that complete understanding of God is the male and the female part. So in the same way, that's why we tend to become romantically interested, because we're part of God. And the problem with our romances down here is not that we have them. The problem with our romances is that they are, there's kama, there's material desire involved, whereas real romantic love is selfless. It's actually pure love. There's no selfishness. There's no lust. It's not like, in the name of love, I really want to gratify my nervous system to an orgasm. So the idea is that in real love, there's this pure romantic love, which is not based on the body or bodily urges, and it's not based on any kind of vanity, like I like you because you like me and it makes me feel great about myself. It's actually pure love. It's actually pure romantic love. And that, so the goal within this tradition is for the soul can achieve perfect love by purification. To purify the soul is not to give up your individual existence, as Shankara would say. It's not to give up your desires, but to purify them so you have pure, loving desires. Anyway, so Sita and Ram in India are like the perfect example of a monogamous couple. Because one thing, even though kings tend to be polygamous, Ram was monogamous. He only had Sita. He only wanted Sita. So they're very much in India the ideal monogamous romantic couple. Well, good stuff. No questions about any of this stuff? Because, yes.
I read at the end, the book said that there was the last book of the Ramayana was possibly inserted, like it's a later edition.
I hope so, yeah.
Is that the one where Ram forces citizens because
Yeah, we'll talk about it tomorrow. I mean, on Wednesday. But well, guess what? In the name of Ram, I guess you get a few minutes on today.